Hello friends, this video on Communication Systems Part 9 is brought to you by examfear.com. No more fear from exam. So we talked about some of the new terms. So you got to know about, I am sure that now you have an idea of the structure of a communication system. It consists of transmitter, receiver and a channel. They are the basic components. Besides, they also have involvement of certain processes or phenomenon like noise, modulation, demodulation, attenuation, amplification and bandwidth. And I'm sure you have understood each of them clearly. Now let us see what are the different ways by which communication can take place. Now broadly, the different ways by which communication can happen are known as modes of communication. Now broadly, there are two basic modes of communication. Communication can occur in two different ways. One is point-to-point communication and the other is broadcast communication. So let us see what are these two modes of communication. What is point-to-point communication? So when I say point-to-point mode of communication, the name itself explains it. The term is a self-explanatory term. Point to point. That means communication taking place between one point and another point. How? Let us see. Here communication occurs between a single transmitter and a single receiver. So you have one point is your single transmitter, the other point is your single receiver. So communication will happen between that single transmitter and the single receiver. That is known as point-to-point mode of communication. Can you think of an example of point-to-point communication where you have a single transmitter and a single receiver? Now, if I talk non-technically, if I give you a real-life example, which normally happens with each one of us, you can think of a scenario like this. One person talking to another person. So it is a face-to-face conversation or it is a one-to-one conversation. So this is the scenario of point-to-point communication. There is a single transmitter, there is a single receiver, right? So this you can think of as a point-to-point mode of communication. For example, this one person talking on phone to another person. So again, there is one sender and one receiver. That is a point-to-point mode of communication. So these are examples which will actually help you to relate the point-to-point mode of communication. Whereas if I say broadcast means communication occurs between a single transmitter and multiple receiver. That means the device which is sending the information, that is just one, but the device which is receiving the information, they are many. So it is a one-to-many communication. So can you think of a real-life example of one-to-many communication? Where do you think one-to-many communication happens? In a classroom, that is the best example. A teacher teaches. There is one single teacher who gives out information. So there is one transmitter, but the receivers are multiple. Maybe there are some 100 students sitting in the class and each of them is receiving the information given by the teacher. So we can say this is an example of broadcast communication. For example, right now I am sharing some information which I have. So I am the single transmitter, but when I talk of the receivers, there are multiple receivers. There are so many people who are actually listening to whatever I am speaking and they are trying to gain information. So that is a broadcast communication. Now, can you think of some devices which actually illustrate an example of broadcast communication? Right, television. So whatever serial or whatever news, sports, whatever comes on a television, do you think that only one person watches it, or whatever comes on the television is telecasted only for a single person? No, there are so many people sitting throughout the world who receives the information. So there are multiple receivers, but there is a single transmitter. So from where that information is given, that source is a single source, but the receivers are many. Similarly, you can also think of radio. So radio is also an example of a broadcast communication. So broadly, these are the two different modes of communication: point-to-point communication and broadcast communication. Now, we have come towards an end of the basics of a communication system. So, I am sure that you have got a good idea about what is a communication system. So, with this idea on the types of modes of communication, let us now talk about a very important concept in communication system, and that is modulation. Now, we have discussed about so many other things as well, right? For example, we talked about bandwidth. We also talked about the transmitters, transducers. We have talked about amplification, attenuation, right? So that was all to give you a basic idea of the structure of the communication system. Now, at this level, we will take up the topic of modulation in detail. There are many other topics related to communication system which you will study later in your higher classes. So for now, let us understand modulation even in more depth. Thank you. Please visit www.examfear.com to watch more videos, attempt free online test, get free study material, find tutors and mentors. Thank you once again.